Hi, my name is Jason Schooley. Thank you for joining me for this virtual presentation. On behalf of my co-authors, Betsy York and Dr. Dennis Skarnecchia, I'm going to be talking about Oklahoma bow fishing values toward non-game fishes and their management. This represents our most recent paper on the topic, published in North American Journal of Fisheries Management. I encourage you to contact me via email with any questions after the presentation. Thank you. In short, bow fishing is simply aquatic bow hunting, or the take of fish with a bow and arrow. It's a fairly understudied yet rapidly expanding sport in the United States. Very little published information was out there prior to the efforts of myself and my co-authors in the last couple of years. What we've revealed was that there's not much management effort occurring, and there's a sore lack of funding for those efforts. But like I said, the sport is growing, and in parallel, there's been a lot of new life history research published on some of the non-game fishes targeted by the sport. In Oklahoma, which is going to be the focus of this talk, we have a long heritage of youth and adult bow fishing and archery in our state. And so we decided it was pretty important for us to get a handle on what's going on in our state. So we did a pretty in-depth survey. That focus and heritage in Oklahoma includes multiple aspects, largest of which is likely our Archery in the Schools program, which includes over 50,000 grade school and high school students across our state, 650 schools. And part of that is an Explore Bow Fishing curriculum. However, Oklahoma also hosts the Youth Bow Fishing World Championship since 2005. We have a lot of local tournaments for adults, and we even attracted the Super Bowl of bow fishing in 2018, sponsored by Bass Pro Shops. Now, this growth not only is in Oklahoma, but is nationwide, and the Archery Trade Association noted during the period 2012 to 2015 that archery interest overall increased by 24%. So we know that it is increasing in Oklahoma, and all of these different aspects combine to contribute to that growth. We didn't know much about our constituents. In fact, in our 2014 Oklahoma Angler Survey, only 5% of our respondents noted that they used other methods, which included bow fishing. So that didn't give us much resolution. So in 2019, we separated out bow fishing as a distinct method, and 4% of our respondents reported using bow fishing, and 4% continued to use other methods, now not including bow fishing. So there's a little bit of implied growth there, and it's easy to see based on our youth school program, Youth World Bow Fishing Tournament, tournaments statewide, large and small, but we also have a very vibrant guide industry, including bow fishing guides. But an additional factor making all this possible is the rapid and thorough dissemination of information on bow fishing in our state, made possible by social media. For example, lots of different groups on Facebook. Now, it's important to note what species are targeted by bow fishing. And this presentation is specific to Oklahoma, but there's a lot in common nationwide. What we're focusing on here are non-game fishes. Those are the only species that can legally be taken by bow fishing in Oklahoma. And what that means is, in our state statutes, we identify what species are game fishes. And if they're not in that list, then by default, they are non-game fish. Well, they can fall into two main categories: native non-game fishes, which include, for the purposes of this presentation, we're talking about the buffalo fishes, which include 3 species, and the gars, which are also native, and they include 4 species. However, non-native invasive fishes are also non-game, and we have 5 species in Oklahoma, 2 of which are the highly invasive carps, bighead and silver carp. We've got 5 species of carps in Oklahoma. So these are the 3 groups of fish: the buffalo fishes, the gars, and the carps, that we're going to be describing in this presentation. Now, it's important to note that, like I implied earlier, there's some new life history research describing the extreme longevity, irregular or episodic recruitment, and their sensitivity to overharvest of these native non-game fishes. So as an example, our state record smallmouth buffalo was aged at 62 years old. The bigmouth buffalo has been aged in Minnesota up to 112 years old and potentially breaking the record for the longest lived freshwater fish. And in Mississippi, alligator gar have been aged up to 95 years old. So as you can see, these are long-lived fish, and there's also research showing that their recruitment is irregular, and there could be long gaps over a decade between successful spawns. So both of those concepts make them sensitive to overharvest. And in the sport of bow fishing with very little regulation, that becomes a concern. So in Oklahoma and in other states, there's a need for management of bow fishing. Like I said, it's not regulated in Oklahoma. Generally, this tracks with nationwide. There are no harvest limits on non-game species with very few exceptions. And one of the things making it more challenging to manage bow fishing compared to, say, bow hunting is that in bow hunting, for example, you can easily distinguish males and females of the targeted species in the field. And so you can manage the harvest of males or manage the harvest of females, but with fish, that's not very possible. The sport itself has been shown to effectively target older, mature females, and this is a conservation concern because those are the actual individuals that we need to conserve in the population to ensure recruitment. And so I provided one example, Stein and King 2019, which demonstrated that bow fishing can effectively target these fish that are sensitive to harvest. And then lastly, we do have, several species of special concern in Oklahoma. For example, the black buffalo is very similar in appearance to a much more common smallmouth buffalo. So we really don't know how many of those are being taken by bow fishing when they probably can't sustain it. Some of the concepts we wanted to dig into with this survey in Oklahoma related to the sporting ethics, social value, and of course the tenets of the North American model. So nationwide, one of the key concerns for bow fishing is wanton waste, or simply the wasting of shot fish. And this is made possible in Oklahoma by something that's legal called shoot and release, where you can actually put an arrow through a fish and then throw it back in the water. You don't have to retain it. It doesn't count toward any bag limit, etc. And so what this can result in a lot of times is glorified piles of dead fish, which as a manager begs the question, what is the beneficial use of this resource? Is it beneficial to allow them to be shot and then discarded? So a couple examples of that, first of which in Minnesota, which we described in one of our other papers, this pile of 32 bigmouth buffalo, which were later aged and found the median age to be 89 years old. So that's a pretty sad example of wasted, long-lived fish. This center photo was from Oklahoma. 3 gentlemen went out overnight and shot over 1,000 gar and videoed themselves discarding them. So this is sort of some of the concerns that we see with bow fishing that need to be addressed through some management action, and important concepts we wanted to dig into with our survey. So it sort of transitions into more of a philosophical discussion, which I'm not going to get into today, but we do address this in one of our other papers. How do we assign value to fishes? Well, it generally comes down to the concept of the North American model, that fish and wildlife are public resources that should not be killed for frivolous reasons. So I'd argue that shooting them and leaving them in a pile is potentially a frivolous reason. So we wanted to look into the bow fishers themselves and ask what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So I won't go into the details. I encourage you to press pause and read this if you like, but we basically did a survey of 15,000 Oklahoma license holders, both bow fishers and non-bow fishers, because we were interested in the opinions of the small number of bow fishers in Oklahoma, but as also the large number of non-bow fishers. And we wanted to know what their what they thought was a suitable use of fish taken. And we'll go into some more detail on that. The respondents, nothing too groundbreaking here. Bow fishers typically skewed more towards male than non-bow fishers. and they skewed a little bit younger, which makes sense. It's a fast-paced, exciting sport, but something we didn't really see coming. Bowfishers generally had more lifetime licenses, or they were more likely to have a lifetime fishing license than non-bowfishers, which sort of logically makes sense that they're more avid fishermen and fisherwomen in general. Regarding the activity of bowfishers and the importance, only about a quarter of our survey respondents had bowfished ever in their life, and 38% of those bowfished in the last year. So if we do the numbers, that works out to about 9.5% of fishing license holders are bowfishers. This doesn't sound like a lot. However, comparing these results, which represent 2020, to our results from 2018, which was 4%, this is more than a twofold increase in bow fishing activity. So that's pretty substantial, and it represents pretty rapid growth in 2 years. Along the same lines as bow fishers having lifetime licenses, potentially being more avid anglers, they use a greater diversity of fishing methods than non-bow fishers. So they take fishing of all types a little more seriously. We asked them to self-rate their skill and experience. Bow fishers on average fish 10 days a year, whereas they fish 56 days a year for all methods. And it's pretty surprising that 53% of respondents have only been bow fishing for 3 years or less. Well, it made sense for some of our analyses to break these out into simply two groups, beginners and experienced, and they're approximately equivalent in size of the groups for future analyses. Some details on bow fishing trips and how they define success. For the most part, just take home message, most night bow fishing occurred from boats and in reservoirs, whereas day bow fishing was generally done from shore and in rivers. And this generally tracks with how experienced an individual bow fisher is. The less experienced are more likely to shoot from shore during the day. The more experienced are most likely to shoot from a boat at night. And that probably relates to their investment in the sport, both in time and financially. Regarding the species preference and take, for this slide, we're talking about those non-game fishes, the carps, the buffaloes, and the gars. When we asked them what they typically targeted, preferred to target, and most often shoot, generally they shoot carps and gars more than buffalo fishes. However, we did find that more experienced bow fishers reported preferring buffalo fish more than beginners. And that may come down to simply fish ID, as the buffaloes, which are a native sucker, are actually often misidentified as carp. So you have to take those answers with a grain of salt. During daytime, carps were noted as more preferred, and at nighttime, bow fishers reported preferring gars. So overall, what was the average take per bow fisher? It came out to about 9.2 fish. Single digit doesn't sound like a lot. However, when you compare it to a hook and line angler, they're generally harvesting far few fish in an average outing. And like most other trends we're talking about here, when you look at experienced bow fishers versus beginner bow fishers, experienced bow fishers definitely harvest more fish, more than twice as many. So that's kind of important when we're talking about putting in potential bag limits or having those discussions. Who are we going to impact, and what does the number need to be to make that impact? One of the more interesting and I think unique aspects of our survey was investigating what are the acceptable uses of fish taken by bow fishing. So this sort of starts to dig into the ethics of the sport. What's being done with the fish? How are they being utilized? So it's fairly easy to say that human consumption is likely a beneficial use. Now, these others, animal consumption, fertilizer use, return to the water, or burial, are those simply different forms of disposal? And can disposal be considered beneficial use? I put the dotted lines there because and we discussed this in the paper, there's a little bit of confusion on how someone is describing fertilizer use. Is that the same thing as burial? And animal consumption, we didn't know necessarily if our respondents were describing feeding domestic animals with the shot fish or leaving them discarded to presumably feed wild animals. So there's a lot going on here that we could potentially dig into a little deeper. When we compared bowfishers and non-bowfishers on the two topics of burial / fertilizer, which we pooled together, or human consumption, you can see how the two constituent groups differ in their opinions. For example, bowfishers feel that it's more acceptable than non-bowfishers to bury or use non-game fish as fertilizer. But they also find that non-game fish are more edible than non-bowfishers do. So there's really a lot to this, and we dig into this in a lot more depth in the paper. But we definitely see different value systems between bowfishers and non-bowfishers regarding game fishes and non-game fishes. When we look at the two constituent groups, bowfishers and non-bowfishers, on the topic of trust, regulations, and the regulation impacts, we find that both bowfishers and non-bowfishers expressed a high level of trust for the management agency on making those decisions. However, like most other things, when we compare beginner bowfishers to experienced bowfishers, we do find that there's a little less trust among the experienced bowfishers. More specifically, when we asked bowfishers how regulations would impact their habits, 23% would bowfish less and 6% would quit bowfishing altogether. So that's a pretty substantial portion of bowfishers who would change their habits if regulations were put in place. And again, we compare experienced and beginner bowfishers in pretty much all aspects and find higher resistance among experienced bowfishers. They have lower trust, greater opposition to regulations, and more likely to bowfish less. So what sort of regulation strategies are even viable here? First, I think it's pretty essential that we have to do something about shoot and release. It's already prohibited in 42 states. We know that release mortality is high, but research is needed in order to affect a regulation on that. And it's really important that we reinforce the value of these fishes by making regs that demonstrate they have value. But the second part of this could potentially be an aggregate daily bag limit. And that's where it's important to know how many fish people are taking in a day, because we would identify what proportion of bowfishers are actually impacted by a bag limit. So an aggregate bag limit is one concept we're tossing around, which would include any species shot by bowfishing legally. However, as you can see from the arrow there, this is sort of an all-for-one scenario where we can't have a bag limit if they can legally shoot a fish and release it. So these are some of the challenges we have. The future of bowfishing is likely poised for additional growth. When we asked non-bowfishers, are you interested in bowfishing? Nearly a third said yes. And when we asked them why they haven't done it, generally lack of knowledge was cited as the most common reason. Those are easily overcome with information campaigns. In summation, of course, bowfishing is growing and some sensible management efforts are needed for long-term sustainability. This is what we do with all types of fisheries. This is not controversial in the slightest. We've demonstrated that Oklahoma bowfishing is growing. Participation doubled in 2 years. Many of those bowfishers are new to the sport, most fishing for fewer than 3 years. And we found there are very low barriers to recruitment. Primarily, the fate of the shot fish is disposal, which we feel is non-beneficial. So it just further demonstrates a social value and equity between game and non-game fishes. And we as a management agency have a responsibility to address that. One way to do that is some common sense regulations. We need to do away with shoot and release in order to affect some sort of aggregate limit on the sport. This could add value to non-game fishes, enhance perception, and lead to sustainability in regulated bow fisheries. With that, I thank you for joining me.